There is a piece of you that has survived longer than any memory in your family. It is not a photograph. It is not a story passed down at a dinner table. It is a name, the one stitched onto the end of yours, inherited without ceremony, carried without question. And for centuries, we assumed it was just a label, a convenience, a way for tax collectors and priests to sort one household from another. Then geneticists started looking closer, and they found something unsettling. In many lineages, that ordinary surname was not just sitting on top of your family tree. It was quietly tracking something underneath it, a thread of Y chromosome DNA, passed from father to son, generation after generation, in almost the same pattern as the name itself. Two systems, one biological, one cultural, moving in parallel through time. And when researchers began comparing them, some surnames lined up with their supposed ancestry with startling precision. Others did not line up at all. A name that claimed one origin carried a genetic signature that pointed somewhere else entirely, toward a forgotten kingdom, a vanished people, a migration nobody had written down. This is the story of what happened when science started asking a question historians never thought to ask seriously. What if your last name is not just a word, but a kind of fossil? For most of human history, surnames were not considered evidence of anything except recent bureaucracy. Historians treated them the way they treated street names, useful for sorting records, but not for understanding deep ancestry. The standard explanation was simple. Hereditary surnames emerged gradually, mostly between the 11th and 16th centuries in Europe, and separately in other parts of the world, as populations grew too large for informal identification. A man became Smith because he worked metal. A family became Baker because of a trade. Others took names from fathers, from villages, from landscapes, from lords they served. This explanation was reasonable. It fit the paperwork. It fit the timeline historians had already built from parish registers, tax rolls, and land deeds. Surnames looked like administrative accidents, recent, arbitrary, disconnected from anything as old as tribe or bloodline. But there was a detail that never quite fit. In several regions, certain surnames clustered geographically in ways that outlasted centuries of migration, war, and displacement. Families with the same name kept turning up in the same valleys, the same highlands, the same river systems, long after the original meaning of the name had been forgotten. Local historians noticed it. Genealogists noticed it. Nobody could fully explain why a name tied to a trade or a location should stay so stubbornly rooted to one place for 4, 5, sometimes 800 years. It was treated as coincidence. A curiosity for genealogy hobbyists, not a subject for serious science. Then genetics entered the conversation, and the coincidence stopped looking so simple. The tool that changed everything was the Y chromosome. Unlike most of our DNA, which shuffles and recombines with each generation, the Y chromosome passes down from father to son almost unchanged, accumulating only small mutations over long stretches of time. In most surname inheriting cultures, that is precisely the same path of family name travels. Father to son, generation after generation. Which meant that, in theory, a surname and a Y chromosome lineage should sometimes move together like two rivers running side by side. Researchers working in genetic genealogy, a field that grew rapidly once DNA testing became affordable, began testing this theory directly. They collected Y chromosome samples from men who shared the same surname but came from different, often distant, branches of a family tree. If the surname really did track a single shared ancestor, those men should carry closely related genetic markers, even if their documented family trees diverged centuries earlier and left no paper trail connecting them. For some names, the results were striking. Men separated by hundreds of years and hundreds of miles, with no known genealogical link on paper, shared a Y chromosome signature closely enough that a common ancestor, sometimes medieval, sometimes far older, became difficult to deny. The name had done what the archive could not. It had preserved a biological memory. But that was only the beginning of the surprise. Because when researchers widened the lens, comparing these Y chromosome lineages not just within a surname, but against broader ancient DNA databases, some names revealed something nobody expected. The genetic signal did not always match the assumed origin of the name at all. A surname long believed to descend from a regional medieval lord carried a Y chromosome lineage more closely associated with populations far to the east, hinting at a massed history of migration, conquest, or absorption that the written record never mentioned. A name rooted in the folklore of one ethnic group showed a genetic signature statistically closer to populations from an entirely different region, as if, at some point, a single man carrying an unexpected ancestry had been absorbed into a community, taken its name, its language, its identity, and then quietly passed his own hidden lineage forward for centuries. That was not a contradiction. It was a signal. The DNA was not confirming the tidy story of names as administrative labels. It was revealing something messier and far more human, that identity, even biological identity, has always been porous. Names could travel through conquest, through marriage, through servitude, through simple relocation, carrying a Y chromosome lineage into communities where nobody would have guessed it came from somewhere else. If you enjoy this kind of science-driven history, the kind where the evidence quietly rewrites the map, consider subscribing, because the deeper you look into ordinary things like names, the less ordinary human history turns out to be. Now the investigation had to widen. Researchers proposed several explanations for why a surname's Y DNA might diverge from its assumed cultural or geographic origin, and no single explanation applied everywhere. One possibility was non-paternity events, moments across centuries where a son was recorded under a father's surname despite not sharing his biological ancestry, whether through adoption, remarriage, or concealment. Over enough generations, even a small rate of these events could scatter unrelated Y chromosome lineages beneath the same family name. A second possibility was polygenetic origin, the idea that some surnames, especially common trade-based or place-based names, were adopted independently by many unrelated men at different times and locations, meaning the name itself was never a single bloodline to begin with, only a shared word. A third, more provocative possibility was population absorption, cases where an individual or small group from a distant or foreign lineage married into, was enslaved by, was adopted into, or otherwise merged with an existing community, took on the local name, and left a genetic signature that would only become visible centuries later, once DNA testing existed to notice it. Each of these explanations was plausible. None of them, on its own, explained every anomaly researchers found. The truth, most geneticists cautioned, likely varied name by name, family by family, which made the overall picture not simpler, but richer. The turning point came as ancient DNA sequencing matured. Earlier surname studies could only compare living men to each other. But as archaeologists recovered genetic material from centuries-old burial sites, some linked to specific documented noble houses, guild records, or regional populations, scientists gained something they never had before, a way to compare a surname's modern Y chromosome lineage against actual ancestors from the period the name was believed to have originated. The results, drawn from a growing body of ancient DNA research across multiple research groups rather than a single landmark paper, did not simply validate the folklore. In several documented cases, the ancient remains associated with a name's founding population carried Y chromosome markers substantially different from what modern bearers of that name display today. In others, the match was closer than expected, suggesting a genuinely unbroken paternal line stretching back far longer than anyone had dared to claim. The pattern that emerged was neither total continuity nor total rupture. It was something stranger, a patchwork. Some names had held their bloodline with remarkable fidelity across 1,000 years. Others had quietly changed hands, changed bloodlines, changed peoples, while the word itself stayed exactly the same. And then came the twist that made genealogists sit up. In several documented surname studies across Europe and parts of Asia, researchers found that a small but consistent number of native surnames, names tied by folklore and tradition to a specific regional or ethnic identity, carried Y chromosome lineages more closely associated with populations from distant steppe regions, from maritime trading networks, or from populations that had been displaced by war or conquest centuries earlier. Not a small linguistic borrowing. Not a coincidence of spelling. an actual paternal bloodline, quietly folded into a community that had no memory of where it came from. Not the origin the name implied. Not even the region the name implied. The surprise was not that mixing had happened. History is full of mixing. The surprise was where, in case after case, the signal pointed toward trade routes historians underestimated, toward conquests that left administrative silence but genetic testimony, toward moments when a single man, absorbed into a foreign household, became invisible in every record except the one written into his descendants' cells. The genome was not erasing the story a name told. It was revealing an older, larger story underneath it, one the name had accidentally protected for centuries without anyone realizing it. This matters far beyond genealogy hobbyists chasing coats of arms. Because what surname genetics quietly demonstrates is something historians have long suspected but rarely could prove at this resolution. Human populations were never sealed containers. They were not pure lines flowing cleanly from one ancestral source to a modern descendant. They were rivers joined by tributaries, some visible, most forgotten, merging, splitting, absorbing strangers, losing branches, gaining others, century after century, while the surface identity, the name, the language, the flag, often stayed remarkably stable, hiding the turbulence underneath. A surname, in this light, becomes something closer to a sealed letter than a label. Most of the time, it faithfully reports what it claims. But every so often, it carries a message its bearers never knew they were sending, evidence of a moment when someone, somewhere, crossed a border that history forgot to record. Picture a highland valley in early spring, the kind of place where a surname first took root, stone farmhouses scattered along a slope, smoke rising from low chimneys, a language spoken there for longer than anyone can date. Generations of men walked those same fields, married within a day's ride, buried their fathers under the same hillside stones. To anyone standing there 500 years ago, the community would have looked closed, self-contained, unbroken. But somewhere in that valley, perhaps 2 or 3 centuries earlier, a stranger arrived. A soldier passing through, a trader who never left, a man displaced by a war fought hundreds of miles away. He took the local name. He raised sons who took it too. And within a few generations, no one remembered he had ever been anything other than local. The valley absorbed him completely, the way a river absorbs a tributary until the water is simply, entirely, one thing. His Y chromosome is likely still there, carried by men who have never left that valley, who consider themselves purely, historically native to that ground, men whose DNA, if tested and compared against the deep past, would tell a quieter, stranger story than the one their name suggests. This is not a story about deception. No one lied. No record was falsified. The name did exactly what names are supposed to do. It held a community together, gave it continuity, gave it meaning. The genome simply remembers something the culture chose, understandably, to forget. If this kind of hidden history fascinates you, let me know in the comments which surname or ancestry mystery you'd want explored next. There are far more of these buried signals than most people realize. What surname genetics ultimately offers is not a correction to history, but an expansion of it. The old assumption, that a name is a simple, recent, administrative fact, was never entirely wrong. Most surnames do track real biological lineages reasonably well, especially over the past few centuries. But scattered throughout that pattern are exceptions, quiet anomalies where a name outlived the truth it was built on, where a bloodline changed while a word stayed the same. Scientists remain cautious about overstating any individual case. A single surname study, even a striking one, is not proof of a hidden kingdom or a secret conquest. Non-paternity events, incomplete sampling, and the sheer complexity of population history mean that every finding needs to be weighed carefully, case by case, against everything else we know. The evidence does not prove a single sweeping narrative. It complicates the simple one we started with, and that complication is where the real history lives. What remains, after all the caution and all the careful hedging, is something quietly extraordinary. Somewhere in the ordinary act of saying your own name, you may be carrying forward the memory of a kingdom no one wrote down, a migration no chronicle recorded, A stranger who was absorbed so completely that only his DNA remembers he was ever a stranger at all. The map we inherited of tidy peoples, tidy homelands, tidy names, was never wrong exactly. It was only ever a sketch. Beneath it lies a far older, far more tangled cartography, written not in ink but in inheritance, waiting patiently inside the cells of people who have no idea they are carrying it. Your name may be the only monument left standing for a history that vanished everywhere else. And somewhere inside you, quietly, faithfully, it is still being written.